Ezzra from the American Multicultural Studies Department, and Paula Lane from the Literacy Studies and Elementary Education Department, School of Education. And Mike will be starting us off, and then Paula will continue. Before we start, I just want to remind you also, next Thursday is the finale of this series, and we will have Lynn Kaminsky from Astronomy and Physics talking about weapons of mass destruction, and Karina Milliken from Biology talking about global climate change. So things that affect all of us on this world. So with that, Mike?
All right. I'll go without the microphone. I think you can hear me. And this one's called The Local Meets the Global, Sonoma State University and the Battle Over Not-So-Scarce Resources. But it could also probably be called Random Thoughts from an Angry Professor. All right. I remember one time in graduate school, one of my colleagues came up to me and said, "The revolution starts in my classroom." I remember thinking that was a stupid thing to say. Conceptually, it was unrealistic. To think that a revolution, one so fundamental to our understanding that it would be the revolution, would take place in a country that has never had one was fool enough. But that it would start in this person's classroom was ridiculous. It was not so much a personal thing, although believe me, this was not the person you wanted leading the revolution, but a structural problem. I think that many of my colleagues, that one being a prime example, have made the mistake of seeing the university as a place where real radical change takes place, where a revolution or even a revolutionary spirit could possibly hatch. At the risk of misrepresenting or understating the vital role in society that colleges and universities fill, I would argue that at their progressive heights, they are nothing but reformist, and as a norm, they're generally purveyors of the status quo, informing people how to take advantage of the current system rather than to change it. I think that is a worthy goal, by the way. Certainly one that I find validating enough to fuel my energies as a teacher and as an advisor. The idea that I can be a facilitator of people's life goals, that I can help them get where they want to go as they envision themselves plugged into the American system, is a very satisfying one, even with the knowledge that the end result will probably be fodder for world inequalities. Merely by prospering in America, some would say, one is providing grist for the mill that systematically makes comfort and safety, much less wealth, a near impossibility for the vast majority of the world's people. The reason I opened with this vision in a speech called The Local Meets the Global, Sonoma State University and the Battle for Not-So-Scarce Resources, is because it puts our campus and system-wide budget crisis into perspective. What we are battling over is not revolutionary, not even in a gradual sense, I would argue. What we fight over at this university will probably not impact the systems of world equality that give us the luxury to sit in a nice room like this, wearing these fine clothes, knowing that we will have dinner tonight. But that doesn't make it unimportant. While the battle over resources at Sonoma State may not mean life and death in a literal sense, in relation to the SSU organism, they are no less dire. What prospers and what dies on this campus is based upon who wins and who loses these battles over not-so-scarce resources. I became a department chair this semester, and it has changed the way I look at our university. I don't know what I expected. I suppose I thought that most of the chairperson's meetings with the deans would be about curriculums and things like that, but they're not. They're about money, meeting target, increasing enrollments, and debt management. The schools don't have enough money to do what the department chairs want them to do, so the guiding philosophy is how to do more with less. What is the reason for this? Is it because universities, in a global sense, are bourgeois institutions at their heart, not necessarily interested in changing how the world works, but really in creating the most successful perpetuators of it that it can? Or is it because Sonoma State, as a misguided local system, has misplaced its mandate to at least give it the old college try? These are things that cannot be answered definitively, but they can be sensed intuitively in ways that create moods on campus that can be harnessed in ways that lead to policies that steer us towards the proper course, whatever that course may be. We must remember that our university, whether we are faculty, students, or administrators, is funded by the taxpayers of this state and their legislative representatives. Importantly, we should look at the Board of Trustees, and even our president, I would argue, as beholden to these interests, and not necessarily to the university community, to the extent that those two bodies are different. Strategically, we cannot approach the problem by thinking that the people in power are doing the right thing simply by enacting the policies that you and I favor. Instead, we must look for the intersection between how to get what we want, whatever that is, and how to allow these people in power to please their constituencies within that process. What is it that we want? And who is this we I keep referring to? What are the versions of food, clothing, and shelter in relation to this campus? What are the essential nutrients that will help the Sonoma State organism to live a healthful life? You will get a variety of responses depending on who you ask. I just finished reading a book that was a national bestseller called The Tipping Point. The Tipping Point looks at epidemics, medical, social, cultural. It tries to see why certain things spread like wildfire in a given context. For example, Hush Puppy shoes, once a standard among young people, had reached such a stagnation in sales by the mid-1990s that the company was thinking of going out of business. Then suddenly, they made a miraculous comeback, selling millions of pairs and rejuvenating the company. How did this happen? The author traces the phenomenon back to a few select hipsters in New York City who bought the shoes used as thrift shops. It's more complicated than that, but not by much. Basically, well-placed, influential people started using the product within a context that made sense to others who began to emulate their behavior. The direction that Sonoma State takes in the future, while on the surface controlled primarily by those who have the most access to Sonoma State's purse strings and other structural factors like government mandates, may be far more flexible than most of us conceive it to be. Perhaps the key to tipping Sonoma State in directions that you or I find most wise or most reasonable is as simple as tipping key influential people into adopting these directions and encouraging others to do the same. Identifying those people is very difficult, of course, and then getting them to adopt and disseminate our vision in ways that stick with the rest of the people is even more difficult. But I think it can be done. The point is that small things, relatively small things, that is, can produce big changes, relatively big changes, that is. What are those small changes that can tip Sonoma State from a place where a large number of faculty feel overworked and underappreciated, where administrators feel that the mandate they supposedly have to run the university is constantly being questioned and undermined, and where students very often feel that their education and overall experience could be improved? For me, there are two key tipping points that, if pursued, might create a domino effect that ripples much wider than the immediacy of the changes themselves. These two changes are GE reform and the move towards making the area around Sonoma State more like a college town. Let me address the second point first, because I think it is typical of some of the misguided energies that have created some of the problems that many of us feel exist here. People like to talk about, quote, student-centered things. I've heard people discuss student-centered learning, student-centered pedagogy, student-centered curricula. But what I'm talking about is a student-centered town. Sonoma State, but more importantly, the community that surrounds it, is not student-centered. Look at what surrounds our campus. Are there many places that students can hang out, go out to eat, go out to dance, go out to drink, go out to hear music, go out for entertainment? Not really. Speaking of which, off the subject, is there any way to actually get a hot breakfast cooked to order on this campus? That's a little thing that would mean a lot. For me, personally, being able to get breakfast on campus would mean coming in earlier to work. It would mean extending my office hours. It would mean me giving back money to the university. It would mean me getting more research done. Seriously. But I digress. But a truly student-centered university would not neglect the important town-university relationship that promotes a living space that is designed with the student in mind first and foremost. I don't see that around here. and I think it is potentially crippling to students, faculty, and community alike. The GE, the center point of our curriculum, is, if you will, bullshit. Students are forced to take 51 units, almost 40% of their college career, of courses they don't necessarily even have an interest in. And yeah, you can tell me all about the student who was convinced to pursue a major because of a GE course they took. First of all, I would argue that these moves are a direct reflection most often of the professor that taught the course, not necessarily the subject matter being taught. And second, I would argue that this happens very infrequently. Like the person who is able to get out of the ghetto simply by working hard, these exceptions to the rule do not justify the systems under which they happen. The vast reduction of requirements in GE and the retooling of the existing ones are the major curricular responsibility that we have if we want to be a student-centered university. How can a curriculum that mandates 40% of its offerings really call itself student-centered? So what to do and where to start? The two things that I feel need to be done are, one, to think of campus space as something that goes far beyond the physical boundaries of the campus, and two, to tailor the GE to students according to major and interests. In the beginning stages, I would ask that the administration look very seriously at acquiring property, as much property as possible, around the campus, and also look to run businesses with the Sonoma State community in mind. Working with local merchants when control is not an option would also be a good start. And as we see, when local merchants and the campus community do the same thing, when they intersect, i.e. North Lights Bookstore versus Sonoma State Bookstore, we don't have cooperation, we have conflict. There's something erroneous in that to me. As for GE, I would ask that it not only be shrunk, but also that it be divided into various tracks for students according to their interests. There is no reason to dismantle the FIG model or the FYE model once the first year is complete. These kinds of models should be integrated into GE so that they continue on throughout the students' 4 years. Both of my proposals basically ask us to expand our definitions of communities. In these cases, learning communities and campus communities, while at the same time reducing the amounts of structures dedicated to creating those communities. We don't need to expand the campus. We need to convert the structures surrounding it into a campus community. We don't need to expand the GE. We need to convert it into a space that creates learning communities. How would these things miraculously tip Sonoma State into a more happy place, into a more perfect university? And how would these things get done? These are questions I cannot exactly answer and will not try to in this speech. But the first step in this process, perhaps, is simply to identify some reasonable and tangible goals. That's what I've tried to do today. Thank you.
We'll have time for questions.
Yikes. How do you, my esteemed colleague here speaks with great passion and force, and I don't even know how to follow that. So I should take a class from you. I think you must be one of those professors that, in fact, students do figure out some sort of career or make some decisions based on.
You know, they would if they didn't run into me by the time they're taking their upper division GEs and it's too late.
Thank you for all that. And thanks to everyone who's here. For whatever reason, it's appreciated. I'm in the School of Ed, and this topic of resegregation of schooling is not an expertise area of mine. I'm a science educator. I do a lot of other things in the School of Ed. But when asked to talk today, I was trying to think what would be interesting for me to learn a little bit more about, and I have some interest in this for a couple of reasons, and I could have talked about a bunch of other things in 30 minutes. I could have talked about immigration issues in education, which are, really something schools and educators struggle with, the achievement gap. I couldn't bear to even talk about the third one, which I don't even want to say the letters for. Charter schools, English language learners. You could probably think of some other issues as well. But before working here, I worked in North Carolina, and at that time, the law school had created a whole day of seminars, and so it was the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill Law School put on a day of looking at this issue, the resegregation of the South. And since I was in the South, and discovering that racism actually plays out or felt very different to me. I'm a native Californian, and it felt very different. The racism that whatever I think that is felt different to me in the South than it does here. And I had learned about that. So when I was thinking of a topic for today that might be of interest, this continues to be something I think about and wonder about for the student teachers and kids that I work with. Just to refresh your memory, in Brown versus the Board of Education, it's a decision that happens in 1954, which is the year before I was born. And it outlawed the state-mandated separation of blacks and whites in schools, and pretty much attributed in 1964 to 1970, the South experienced its greatest increase in racial integration, as what appears to be, by most opinions, a direct result of this aspect. And this is a civil rights issue, an issue that schooling and equality are linked, and that members of the society deserve a kind of education, and that this was a move to do that. In 1974, there was another U.S. Supreme Court decision which actually determined that we couldn't really do this, that certain suburban desegregation is in fact not legal. There's a bunch of folks who have studied this for a long time, much smarter than me, and many of you may have a greater expertise or have read more broadly or experienced this. But looking at the Civil Rights Project out of Harvard and looking at some of their publications, there's some papers that are full of some statistics and data that help us see exactly what the current trends are. In fact, if you look at school data and numbers, the American South is resegregating. It used to be an issue about blacks and whites, and now we're increasingly talking about Latinos as well as blacks and whites. That's how the data is often discussed and how people are thinking of what this resegregation means. As there's an increase in African American and Latino students in suburban schools, there remains segregation within those communities. So it isn't even as if in suburban schooling, as blacks and Latinos move out to those areas or are in those schools, that those groups are integrated. All racial groups at this time, however, if we think current day, have greater diversity except whites. So as you look at schools, all others are integrating and mixing more in schooling than whites. In summarizing what other people have sort of said is where we are right now, the attention to civil rights issues as related to race, as related to schooling, seems to have waned. That it is no longer what we talked about. The idea of civil rights, the debate is a different one now. It isn't so much what it was in the 70s. It's a different kind of civil rights argument. In fact, that perhaps I get to have whatever schooling I want to. That's my right. And whites have certainly fought for a kind of retooling of what civil rights actually means. And as people have studied schools, big ones, small ones, many school districts have become more racially segregated from whites in their population. So, I mean, the data is in. This is happening. It is a real phenomenon, and it happens in the South, and it happens on the West and North. It's a real phenomenon. I'm going to switch to a 1955 quote by Zora Neale Hurston. and many of us, of course, know who she is. But if you know one thing, it's that Zora she didn't fit the norm of what the other radical blacks, artists, etc. of her time. She didn't fit the mold, and she went against some of the what was considered, what some of the leaders in the black community were hoping that they could sort of come together and say about how they should fight against racism. So this is from the Orlando Sentinel. It gets printed in, and I'm going to read the whole thing to you, and there are parts of it in my slides. Editor, I promised God and some other responsible characters, including a bench of bishops, that I was not going to part my lips concerning the U.S. Supreme Court decision on ending segregation in public schools of the South. But since a lot of time has passed and no one seemed to touch on what to me appears to be the most important point in the hassle, I break my silence just this once. Consider me just thinking out loud. I regard the ruling of the U.S. Supreme Court as insulting rather than honoring my race. Since the days of the never-to-be sufficiently deplored Reconstruction, there has been current the belief that there is no greater delight to Negroes than physical association with whites. The doctrine of the white mare. Those familiar with the habits of mules are aware that any mule, if not restrained, will automatically follow a white mare. Dishonest mule traders made money out of this knowledge in the old days. Lead a white mare along a country road and slyly open the gate, and the mules in the lot would run out and follow this mare. This ruling being conceived and brought forth in a sly political medium with eyes on 56 and brought forth in the same spirit and for the same purpose, it is clear that they have taken the old notion to heart and acted upon it. It is a cunning opening of the barnyard gate with the white mare ambling past. We are expected to hasten pell-mell after her. It is most astonishing that this should be tried just when the nation is exerting itself to shake off the evils of communist penetration. It is to be recalled that Moscow, being made aware of this folk belief, made it the main plank in their campaign to win the American Negro from the 1900s on. It was the come-on stuff. It is well known that I have no sympathy nor respect for the tragedy of color school of thought among us, whose fountainhead is the pressure group concerned with this court ruling. I see no tragedy in being too dark to be invited to a white school social affair. The Supreme Court would have pleased me more if they had concerned themselves about enforcing the compulsory education provisions for Negroes in the South, as is done for white children. Them's my sentiments, and I am sticking to them. Growth from within, ethical and cultural desegregation. It is a contradiction in terms to scream race pride and equality while at the same time spurning Negro teachers and self-association. That old white mare business can go racking on down the road for all I care. Again, that was Zora Neale Hurston in 1955. I don't think any of us would think that the civil rights purpose of equality in schooling and that Brown versus Board of Education was anything but a good thing, something that we should fight for, because the statistics are that when schools are integrated, the minority, or quote minority students, score better, and that the scores in general at those schools are higher than all minority schools or schools that aren't integrated. The causes of resegregation are speculated about, and we might talk about this idea of white flight, which is, of course, a book, and it's a phrase we talk about. Schneider wrote the book a few years ago. Some idea that whites are, if they were in integrated communities, fled them to get away sort of from minorities. But Robert Self, who wrote the book American Babylon, Race and the Struggle for Post-War Oakland, our pals over there, in bringing this argument a little closer to home and not talking so much about the South, he has an argument that places that this idea that there was white flight is actually it's not a very deep understanding, and that's a very simplistic way to think about it, that there was in fact a push and a pull. And the whites didn't merely flee the city, they were drawn into suburban city building by material and ideological incentives, a political economic issue, and this encouraged suburban residents to take a narrow view of their social responsibility. As Oakland was becoming more and more a high percentage of blacks as the main residents, as whites moved, and I'm from Fremont, South Bay, right, across the bay, that's where I grew up. That whole corridor, Hayward, San Leandro, Fremont, Milpitas, and then you start to get to San Jose, which is another set of issues. But in the East Bay, that was development time. And for my parents in the 50s and 60s, this was about owning a home. And the idea that they could go to the suburbs and own a home would outstrip any other ideology, and an idea that in this time frame, and you could work and have an American dream, sort of, I think, argues that it allowed people to not worry about anything else. You could kind of put aside what might be social responsibilities, or you put your energy into the local church or maybe the bowling league, but it wouldn't be about integration or a race, perhaps, issue. Which brings me to think, if we're resegregating schools, should we be focusing on the rights argument, which is a civil rights, that's what the law is based on. The right of all students to have a high-quality education. Might we think about should we be thinking about an economic argument or social arguments? How could we be thinking about schooling? Because if you think about what Zora said, and as a black woman in the 50s, she didn't think it was such a great idea. Okay, one voice, but what are we trying to do? And to build on Mike's point, who's the we in this discussion? Yesterday, I added this slide. I don't know if you read the New York Times, but yesterday,
wow,
an amazing piece. Hey, could you raise your hand if you saw this yesterday? I mean, does it kind of blow your mind? Yeah. White officials call more fouls on black players. The full report has like 9 pages of statistics at the back that I can't even understand. The NBA, of course, did their own study and counter this, but all of those who the New York Times asked to read the article, the study by, I didn't put their names here, but the studies by Wolfers and Price, all the people they asked to review it said, because it isn't published yet, it's going to be presented Sunday at a conference, an economic conference, and it looks like, the study's going to hold up to scrutiny if a 3-person team of referees, if we look at the race makeup of the referees and we look at the percentage of players who are black or white, if we look at court time, if we look at new or vet players, if we look at home and away games, looking at all of that, it turns out that it is statistically significant that white refs call more fouls on black players. You had your hand up. Please, go ahead.
It seems you're forgetting it's the other way around, too.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
They
Well,
did point that out.
please, I wasn't done, but please say that. I'd love your input. Will you say, and you say, what do you recall from reading this?
Well, that at the same time they said that black officials would call more fouls on white players.
And that was in the same study that has this right here.
Yeah.
So, and it wasn't the NBA study.
So I started with resegregation of schooling. I've tried to talk about what a civil rights argument is, and I've started and talked about the South, what we were able to do in the South during a certain number of years, and that if we think any of this is true, and if we think about decision making and racism in our society, then I'd like to think, where should educators, because I was invited to talk about education as a subtext here, as a focus, where should we go with this? And we continue to, the idea that if you're poor and you're a minority person, you probably have a really terrible school. I mean, the statistics are in. The facts are, if you live in a poverty-ridden poor side in St. Louis or New York, you go to a school that doesn't have the same quality of education based on a whole host of standards than you would if you went to a school that was more integrated or had more money and was in a different location. And if integration isn't the way to do it, if people will continue to find ways to fight integration, which is what has happened since the Brown versus Board of Education ruling came down, people have fought it forever. And including local arguments here in Berkeley, in San Francisco, and in Oakland about what those school districts can do about race-based programs. You cannot offer a program for any particular group. You cannot say, I have an after-school program for Latinas. That's a civil rights argument, not an equality argument. And I far more know about gender inequality in the literature as an interest of mine. And I like to think that it's the bathroom argument at sports stadiums or arenas. If you want to have the equality argument, and this is not to, diminish the importance of the issue we're talking about, but if you want to talk about equality, you put in the same square footage for the men's bathroom as the women's bathroom. And you put in, similar piping, and you maybe you change some of the fixtures, but you basically allot the same amount of space. That's equality. But that's not really what people need. Women need, or at least in our current way that society operates, women need more space, more stalls, as seen by the line that is outside at every break. And this would include at movie theaters. Every establishment where large groups of people go that are both men and women, the women's line is always huge. The men's is not. But the spaces are equal because we haven't created a space that actually meets the needs of how we live or how our society functions. If we want to make schooling equal, what should we do to ensure that everyone has access to a high-quality education? I'm not sure the law mandating a civil rights argument will help us deal with racism, which is in essence the point of it. So I end by just, what might we talk about? What should schooling worry about as the best way to increase opportunities for all students, especially minority students in U.S. schools today? And and it's a true question for myself. Should I be fighting for and working toward reestablishing integration in schools through mandates, or is there another slice, another view that would integrate economic, social, legal aspects to this problem that would make more sense? And that there's not a legal argument is going to be probably one of our least effective means to actually change how people think or make calls on a basketball court, that we're talking about racism when we talk about schooling and integration. So a thought piece, and I hope provoked at least some thinking or some other questions. So thank you.
Very provocative talks. I'm sure there's some questions. Why don't we start here and we'll go to Tom. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. For Mike, I just want to say that was one of the greatest speeches I've ever heard, and I've heard many.
Thank you.
I think you have the Picasso chromosome. that I commute, and I feel that I'm inside the university once I'm inside the university. Yet a lot of my friends go to UC Berkeley, and once I'm in the University Avenue, I feel like I'm at the university because there's the University Avenue, and the whole community is revolved in Berkeley. I feel is revolved around the university, right? By naming one of the avenues, one of the main avenues, the University Avenue. I think if we had a street called the University Avenue or Sonoma State University Avenue or something like that, more people would take into consideration that we actually have a university here in Rockland Park.
The irony is that we are on East Cotati Avenue, in fact.
So, I think one of the best ways is to name a street and to one of the main streets that leads to the university, to name it after the university or related to the university. It's East Cotati doesn't sound like I'm headed towards the university, and it makes a huge difference, like you pointed out, to even have a place to buy food. I rarely buy food here in this campus. I wish there would be more diversity of food. That way I don't have to drive outside, and even outside there's not, besides fast food, that's all. But anyways, I strongly agree. And I have so my question is, have you tried emailing this to faculty or to administration?
I didn't. You have these intuitive feelings of discontent, like when you go to find some breakfast or something and you can't. But I never really thought about articulating it until I sat down and had to write this a few days ago because the deadline was approaching. And one of the frustrating things, I think, is that my speech ends without a real plan for action, just for ideas, because I don't know how to really get things done around here. And I also feel that those who try to get things done get shut down very often. And as far as a tipping point goes, I'm not sure if I'm one of those people who could create that feeling or not. But you saying something like that does encourage me to think about how someone like me, not necessarily me, would go about doing so. So the answer is no. This is the first forum I've ever presented this in, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who has thought that. But hopefully people have heard it now, and let's see what happens, I guess. It's
Mike,
tough.
I wanted to say that Aaron and I are both on the GE subcommittee about reform, and I think we should we could take forward your points or certainly present that to the committee as they're desperately trying to think about how reform should take place.
But with GE reform, I'm on an arts and humanities curriculum committee, so that's something that the university has said it's working on. It would be much tougher to do the other thing with campus space, because I think that there is something of an adversarial relationship between the town and the university right now. But it's something that for the life of me I can't understand. To me, this university really is the lifeblood of Rohnert Park. And unless I'm missing something, they should be bending over backwards to accommodate us. I think that there might be an issue that our administration, namely our president, has alienated the town somehow. I'm not sure, though. I don't want to talk about things I don't really know about. But it seems illogical that this should not be a college-oriented town.
Let me just follow up. Also, just yesterday, I got a survey in my email box asking about food options on campus, and one of the things was we're doing breakfast.
Yes.
I said, well, personally, no, because I only live a mile away. But for people who come in, so I think there are some people who are trying to gather that information. So I encourage any of you who have gotten that in their email or see surveys about, at least on campus, what some of the options could be. I encourage you to give that feedback.
I tried filling out that survey yesterday, and after the 40th minute, I said, forget it. I'm not doing this anymore. And I think that it is typical of, and there was no space for comments where I could just write, give me breakfast. Instead, I got to fill out all this demographic information about what and when I eat on Friday and stuff like that. And I think that's typical of the way things are done around here. A consulting firm was hired from the outside who knows nothing about this community to conduct some formal sociological and demographical study about how people eat without any knowledge of the people themselves or the local character or the space of the area or the urban planning. And that's just a lazy way to do things. I mean, people could have gone around to the campus community and physically asked people. But instead we have this outside commodity doing this massive information campaign in which my breakfast beef is 1/1000th of the information being asked for. You know, that's not the way to get things done, I don't think.
Your objective is community. That objective is very different.
That might be a capitalist.
Three different kinds of investment, capital investment,
Right.
that are centered around food.
Good point.
And that's something completely different.
It-
You're absolutely right. You're talking about, if you want community, you have to go about asking it completely different.
Yeah, I only went for like 25 minutes and then quit
Yeah.
answering it.
I mean, and I'm passionate about the issue, actually. I mean, it's something I was writing about. It's my number one beef about Sonoma State is that I can't get breakfast. And
It's no small thing.
and it is no small thing. It would really increase work output by me anyway. And I can't even get that said in a survey designed to say it.
Even at the JC, you can get breakfast in the morning.
Oh,
Because
yeah.
I've been to classes.
You used to be able to get breakfast on campus.
Yeah.
Well, and
My comment was just more, having grown up and being raised here in Sonoma County, when I first graduated from high school, Sonoma State was not a place I wanted to go to school because of the lack of that university feeling of the area. So if that was improved, you would be getting a lot more.
his statement is truly wonderful, that East Cotati Avenue and Rohnert Park Expressway are the roads that lead us to Sonoma State, town over school. The JC, as far as I know, it's on College Avenue. You're right. Names make a difference.
Well, I think we were definitely alienating this right now. We just shut down moms. I mean, it would definitely be, it had to come from us. We definitely were influence. Anything they tried to do. We're alienating.
Let me ask a question in the form of sort of trying to bring a few of these things together. Because clearly, universities, or higher education generally, is the most segregated place of education nationally in terms of levels of education. And I think there's a parallel between changing the names of streets and mandating segregation and integration in schools that gets at the failure that you're putting your finger on, both of you, right? I mean, you're talking about it in terms of race and opportunities for educational growth and career advancement and so forth, and you're talking about the lack of a community. And some of the things that I hear from some of the students of color that I work with in my classes is that they don't want to come here either, but it's not necessarily because of the lack of community, or the way they describe that lack of community is not feeling welcome and not feeling that there's a place that their interests, their needs, their experiences, their backgrounds, their politics have a place. And so there's a different, that feeling of hostility, right, is very palpable. And so I'm a little bit confused about what the sort of message or the position or how we're thinking about racism specifically, right? In other words, maybe you could elaborate, Paula, a little bit about what Zora was saying to you. In other words, what does that comment, because that comment was really interesting. I haven't heard that comment before from her, and I really appreciate you sharing that. And I think it does really get at the unspoken politics of civil rights, right? And what civil rights really was about. And I think that's an important place for us to elaborate a little bit further in thinking about what is community. Because there's stuff that we're not talking about. When food is important, and I won't take you to task on that at all. But there's also other issues, right, that I think, for me, a little bit more essential. And so, can you elaborate a little bit on what Zora's comment means to you and this problem?
Well, and I'm sure other people, have ideas about what that, spoke to you as well. But, when she says maybe we could have worked at mandating and requiring school for black kids, That wasn't that wasn't part of, after Reconstruction. Where's the law that all black kids are supposed to go to school? Somehow the premise was, we have good schooling, and a civil rights argument, whoever is making it, says, let's make sure black kids can go to those same schools. That by law you can't prevent them from going to the schools that we have that we think are good. Well, what about a completely different tack would be, what about making good schools? And that a person could choose based in local communities, which would try to tie some of what we're saying together, so there's a federal law that mandates something, but in local communities, people leave or come or go, or can't get a bank loan to go get a house they'd like, or can't, that the way you create equality in schooling is not with a federal mandate, that it would come from communities or opportunities that are both social and economic, that mandating the school component was never going to do anything about racism. It was a rights argument that allowed a black student to go to a school of their choice. That might be a really great school. And I believe in education, and I think that is a wonderful goal. But if that law then has not stuck, if people worked to dismantle it, is the real issue allowing black kids to go to rich, white, or better schools, or is it that we need better schooling in general, and that local communities might decide that our energy should go to dealing with racism and not schooling? Schooling's just one piece of racism, and you can mandate some integration, but you can't change how people think or how people feel, and that you're creating a schooling opportunity, but you're not taking care of underlying causes or problems or reasons for the original reason that you needed to make the federal law.
The trickiest thing I see with this particular, the legal solution, is that in a capitalist society, and again, we do have to be careful about our mixed feelings towards capitalism, because capitalism enables us to have this wonderful library, because Charles Schultz got all this money to donate it. It's a slippery slope in terms of what we wish for. But we are in capitalism right now in America, and it seems to be there's not much we can do about it. So let's accept it for a moment. In that system, more money buys you fundamentally better things. Better food, better health care, better nutrition, better clothes, a better car. How do we get people thinking that better schools shouldn't fall under that model too? Without getting these people who have bought into capitalism to say, well, just dismantle capitalism, which they won't say. How do we get them to think that school is something different than all those other fundamental things that money buys you? That's what I think has been missed. And I'm not sure what the argument is other than you have to be in school, that the government mandates that you have to be in school.
Is it that people don't value school, or is it that the people don't have the power to get a school?
I have a graduate student I met with last night, and until a year ago, she worked at a dysfunctional, high minority middle school in Vallejo. And she was tearing her hair out, the agony of this place. We are really talking a terribly dysfunctional school in terms of education, what students do, what teachers have, safety. Terrible place to work, agonizing, bad for kids, bad for teachers. She got a job last year in Orinda. Okay? Orinda, Lafayette. She teaches at like Akalani's High School, or one of those. She's a science teacher. She said going to work is like in heaven to her. And they don't get more money from the federal government. They get they're the same money that any school would get in their same demographics or location, but the parents raise $125,000 a year to support the sports programs, the technology program, and the science program. If she wants a microscope that can show cells up on a screen through a computer to her students, she just has to fill out a form. That's inequality in schooling. That's not the same schooling that a few miles away a student would get. And so until we can talk about, that's a school community that has money that says whatever the federal government does, we can just take care of what we think it needs. Well, so what do I do if I'm not wealthy in Orinda and I go to a different school where I can't afford a house? How is it that the government doesn't help me as a teacher or as a student or as a parent have the microscope that would make showing the cell and doing analysis of DNA analysis just as cool, good, advanced, and sophisticated? That's a money supply issue. And it's by the local community. So we mandated by a federal law that anybody should have access to that school during a civil rights argument, but we didn't mandate that schools provide high-quality education to students. And the closest we've come is No Child Left Behind, which in fact is punitive and demeaning and exacerbates the achievement gap. And the only schools under sanctions who now don't have art and have had all of the creative issues out of their program, who now spend mornings from 9 to 12 on scripted literacy and math programs, are poor schools because they didn't score high enough. There's no rich school that No Child Left Behind has caused to do anything different. Only poor schools. In the name of the achievement gap, we now have poor kids who go to school where teachers no longer make lesson plans. They open a book and they read, and on Tuesday we're on story 1, and at 10:20 we should be asking the questions, and at 10:30 you will now take out the workbook page. It's really ugly. So a federal law that said, we're going to do something about achievement, in fact only penalizes poor schools, which are pretty much filled with minority kids.
Did you have one more question?
Yeah, I do.
Okay,
Sorry, I
go
don't
ahead.
know the time of it.
We have maybe 2 minutes.
Oh, okay. I'm not sure I understand what your analysis is. I mean, are you saying that it's not enough money, or are you saying that the communities don't have the same value of education? I'm not sure I understood it.
If the laws I want to fight for would require that students have equal education regardless of their own economic basis. And a place to start is that every program should be what Orinda has. Schools, and it builds on Mike's argument that if we're going to talk about a capitalist society, that money talks, schools, we need to have schools that have that ability, that they have that much money to have whatever it is they need to do the high quality education. And if we leave it, the civil rights argument was that a kid could go to any school. The issue we need to fight for is that we make all the schools high quality, so it wouldn't matter, the race issue would be less of an issue. And local communities could help determine which are the most successful schools as well. Orinda calls on local community members to donate money to spend time in classrooms. If you ever taught at a rich school, moms and parents are there all the time. When you go to a poor area school, there's less family involvement because parents work. So parent involvement changes. Well, how do you change that? Local communities get what they need because they have funding and they have babysitters, or they have night programs, or they have language programs at night. That takes money. So to equal these, if I go back to the bathroom example, Orinda doesn't need very much from other people, but a poor school in a poor area might need more square footage, more whatever, in order to make it a high quality school. So instead of saying a civil rights argument, let any kid go to the rich Orinda school, which we know immediately Orinda would do something to fix that, what we need is to enable any school to have what it needs. And local communities could help determine what that would be, not federal mandates.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, everyone, for participating.
Resources and priorities that we all have to take into consideration in whatever areas we're in. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Don't forget next week.
Thank you.
Mike, really, do you want us to have that? I mean, I think you really need to, I don't know what